Have you ever wondered how a woman with a pound of ground beef, 3 children to feed, and 45 minutes before her husband walked through the door, managed to put a real dinner on the table every single night? Picture a Wednesday evening in 1974. The kitchen in a small ranch house in Ohio, or Indiana, or anywhere in between. The counters are clean, because she cleaned them this morning before work. The children are doing something loud in the next room. She opens the refrigerator, and there it is. A pound of ground beef wrapped in white butcher paper, sitting on the second shelf where she put it 2 days ago. She does not panic. She does not reach for a cookbook. She already knows what she is going to do. That pound of ground beef is not a limitation. In her hands, it is a starting point. If these meals remind you of someone, or of a kitchen that still lives somewhere in your memory, this channel exists to keep those stories alive. Subscribe and stay close. We remember these things together. Sloppy Joes. Sloppy Joes arrived in American home kitchens sometime in the 1930s, and by the 1970s had become one of the most beloved weeknight suppers a family could sit down to. The name came from the loose, saucy nature of the filling, which had a tendency to escape the bun no matter how carefully you held it. Nobody minded. She browned the ground beef with chopped onion until the pink was gone and the meat had developed a slight crust at the edges, then drained the fat and stirred in ketchup, a spoon of mustard, a little brown sugar, and Worcestershire sauce. The whole thing simmered for 10 minutes while the flavors came together and the sauce thickened just enough to hold its shape. Spooned generously onto soft white hamburger buns, it smelled of sweet tomato and browned beef, and something faintly smoky from the Worcestershire. The children ate 2 each and asked for a third. The buns were soft, and the sauce soaked into them, and the whole meal cost under $2 and took 20 minutes, and nobody at that table felt they had been given anything less than a real supper. 40 years later, people still ask their mothers for this recipe. American goulash. American goulash had nothing to do with the Hungarian original except the name, and in the 1970s, that suited everyone perfectly well. This was the weeknight pasta dish that appeared in Betty Crocker cookbooks and Better Homes and Gardens, and on the tables of families across the Midwest and the South. A one-pot supper that asked almost nothing of the cook and delivered everything to the table. She browned ground beef with onion and garlic in a deep skillet, added a can of diced tomatoes and a can of tomato sauce, poured in a cup of water, added elbow macaroni directly to the pot, and covered the whole thing, and let it simmer until the macaroni was tender and had absorbed the tomato beef broth around it. The pasta cooked right there in the sauce, which meant it tasted of the sauce all the way through rather than just on the surface. The finished dish was thick and deeply red, and smelled of beef and garlic and cooked tomato in a way that carried clearly from the kitchen to wherever the children were in the house. She served it in wide bowls with a piece of bread on the side, and sometimes a dusting of Parmesan from the green can. 1 pot, 1 pound of beef, 1 bowl that finished every time. Meatloaf. Meatloaf was the 1970s ground beef recipe that people either grew up loving or grew up pretending not to love until they were old enough to admit the truth. It appeared in every general cookbook of the decade, on every church potluck table, and in the regular rotation of virtually every American household that bought ground beef, which was virtually every American household. She mixed the ground beef with breadcrumbs soaked in milk, a beaten egg, grated onion, Worcestershire sauce, salt, and pepper, working it together with her hands in a large bowl until it just came together without being overworked. Overworking it made the loaf dense. She knew not to overwork it because her mother had told her, and her mother's mother had told her. She pressed it into a loaf pan, spread a mixture of ketchup and brown sugar across the top, and baked it at 350 degrees for an hour. The glaze caramelized and darkened, and the smell that came from the oven during that hour was among the most specific and unmistakable smells of a 1970s American kitchen. Sweet and savory, and deeply meaty all at once. Cold meatloaf sandwiches the next day were better than the original. That was not an opinion. That was a fact everyone in the house agreed on. Hamburger Helper Skillet. Hamburger Helper launched in 1971, and by the middle of the decade, it had become one of the most purchased grocery items in America, which made it both a cultural artifact and an honest reflection of what the 1970s home cook actually needed on a busy weeknight. The idea that a box could provide everything except the meat was, at the time, close to revolutionary. She browned the ground beef, drained the fat, added the contents of the box and the specified amount of water and milk, stirred everything together, and let it simmer covered for the time indicated on the package. The noodles or rice cooked directly in the liquid alongside the beef, and everything finished together in a single pan. The results smelled of beef broth and cheese powder and comfort in a way that was entirely its own, and entirely real to anyone who grew up eating it. The texture was creamy, and the flavor was savory and slightly salty, and the kind of thing that children ate without complaint and adults ate without apology. It was not fancy. It was not pretending to be. That honesty was part of what made it work. Stuffed bell peppers. Stuffed bell peppers appeared in American cookbooks long before the 1970s, but the decade made them a weeknight staple rather than a special occasion dish. The slow cooker helped, and so did the wider availability of ground beef and the practical insight that a pepper could serve as its own bowl, which meant fewer dishes and a tidier table. She cut the tops off green bell peppers, removed the seeds, and stood them in a baking dish. She mixed ground beef with cooked rice, onion, egg, salt, pepper, and a spoon of Worcestershire sauce, and filled each pepper tightly with this mixture. A can of tomato sauce went over the tops, and the whole dish went into the oven at 350 degrees for about an hour. The peppers softened as they baked, and their sweetness deepened, and the tomato sauce caramelized slightly across the tops of the meat filling, and made each one look polished and intentional. The smell was of baked pepper and beef and cooked tomato, warm and savory, and particular to this dish in a way that nothing else quite replicated. She served one pepper per person on a plate, with the sauce spooned around it, and the whole meal looked considerably more composed than the effort required. 5 ingredients, 1 pan, a table that looked like she had planned it all along. She had. She always had. Chili. Chili in the 1970s was not a recipe so much as a philosophy, and every family had a version they believed was the correct one. Texas chili had no beans. Cincinnati chili had cinnamon. Midwestern chili had kidney beans and was served over spaghetti on Fridays. The arguments were friendly and unresolvable, and the chili was always good regardless of which version landed in the bowl. She browned ground beef with onion and garlic until the beef was crumbled and the onion had gone soft and translucent. Then added a can of kidney beans, a can of diced tomatoes, tomato sauce, chili powder, cumin, salt, and pepper. She let it simmer uncovered for 30 minutes, stirring occasionally, until the sauce had reduced and thickened and the flavors had settled into each other. The smell of chili simmering on a stovetop is one of the defining smells of the American home kitchen. Warm and spiced and slightly smoky. The kind of smell that travels through walls and announces itself to everyone in the house, whether they were hungry or not. By the time it was done, everyone was hungry. That was never a coincidence. Taco night. Taco night entered the American household in force during the 1970s, partly through the growing availability of old El Paso taco kits, and partly through the expanding influence of Tex-Mex cooking that was beginning its long migration northward and eastward from the border states. By the middle of the decade, it had become a Friday night institution in homes across the country. She browned ground beef with onion, drained the fat, and stirred in the packet of seasoning from the kit with a little water. letting it simmer until the liquid had absorbed and the beef was coated in the dark, cumin-heavy sauce. She set out the shells, the shredded lettuce, the diced tomato, the sour cream, the cheese, and the hot sauce, and let everyone assemble their own. The shells were crunchy and slightly oily, and they broke apart in a specific, satisfying way when you bit into them. The seasoned beef smelled of cumin and chili and garlic. The cold sour cream against the hot meat was a contrast that worked every time without explanation. Taco night was not just a meal. It was the one night of the week where everyone got to make their own decisions at the table, and nobody argued about it. Meatballs and tomato sauce. Italian-American meatballs had been part of the American table since the great waves of Southern Italian immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And by the 1970s, they had traveled so thoroughly into the mainstream that a Polish family in Wisconsin or a German family in Minnesota made them with exactly the same confidence as a Sicilian family in Brooklyn. She mixed ground beef with breadcrumbs soaked in milk, a beaten egg, grated Parmesan, garlic, dried parsley, salt, and pepper, rolled the mixture into balls the size of a golf ball, and browned them in a skillet in a little olive oil until they were dark on the outside. She did not cook them through in the pan. They finished in the sauce. She poured canned, crushed tomatoes into the pan with garlic and dried oregano and a pinch of sugar, returned the meatballs to the sauce, covered the pan, and let everything simmer for 30 minutes. The meatballs turned the tomato sauce meaty and rich as they finished cooking through, and the sauce worked its way into the outer layer of each meatball and made the two inseparable. Served over spaghetti with bread to drag through the remaining sauce, this was the meal that made everyone feel like somebody's grandmother was cooking. Hamburgers. The hamburger seems too obvious to include in any list of notable recipes, and yet the homemade hamburger of the 1970s, ground beef seasoned simply and cooked in a cast-iron skillet on the stovetop when the weather did not permit a backyard grill, was a genuinely different thing from what most people mean by a hamburger today. It was simpler, more direct, and tasted more purely of beef. She seasoned the ground beef with nothing more than salt and pepper, formed it into patties without overworking the meat so the texture stayed loose, and pressed a shallow dimple in the center of each one so they cooked flat rather than doming up. She cooked them in a dry cast-iron skillet over medium-high heat and did not press them with a spatula because pressing squeezed out the juices. The beef sizzled loudly when it hit the hot pan and smelled of caramelizing protein in a way that was immediately appetizing. The exterior developed a dark crust. The interior stayed pink and juicy. Served on a soft white bun with mustard, ketchup, lettuce, and a slice of American cheese that melted slightly from the heat of the patty, it was pure and complete. Nobody needed to explain why this worked. It just worked. Shepherd's pie. Shepherd's pie was technically a British dish made with lamb, and in its American 1970s form, it was made with ground beef and called shepherd's pie anyway, which bothered the British considerably, and nobody else at all. It appeared in American cookbooks throughout the decade as a practical way to use a pound of ground beef and turn it into something that looked and ate like a complete dinner. She browned ground beef with onion, added frozen mixed vegetables, and a can of cream of mushroom soup thinned with a little milk, seasoned everything, and spread it in a baking dish. She covered the whole thing with mashed potatoes, smoothed the surface, ran a fork across the top to make ridges, and dotted the surface with small pieces of butter. It went into the oven at 375 degrees for 30 minutes. The potato topping browned at the ridges and stayed soft beneath. The meat filling bubbled up at the edges of the dish, and the cream of mushroom sauce made the whole thing savory and rich in a way that the ingredients alone did not quite predict. She cut it into squares and served it straight from the dish, and the table was quiet for a few minutes, in the particular way that means a meal is good. Stuffed cabbage rolls. Stuffed cabbage rolls belonged to every Central and Eastern European tradition simultaneously. Polish, Hungarian, Ukrainian, Russian, Slovak. And by the 1970s, they had become sufficiently American that they appeared in mainstream cookbooks without any ethnic identification at all, simply as stuffed cabbage. Every family that made them slightly differently, and every family believed their version was correct. She softened cabbage leaves in a pot of hot water, mixed ground beef with partially cooked rice, grated onion, egg, salt, and pepper, placed a spoonful of filling on each leaf, and rolled them into tight bundles that she packed into a baking dish or a heavy pot. Over the top, she poured a sauce of canned tomatoes, which balanced the richness of the meat and gave the whole dish its characteristic sweet-sour quality. They baked low and slow for an hour and a half, the cabbage going completely soft and sweet, the rice finishing inside the rolls and expanding slightly so each one felt substantial and dense. The tomato sauce reduced and darkened around them. The smell was of cooked cabbage and braised beef and warm tomato. Meatball soup. Meatball soup was the recipe that turned a small amount of ground beef into a meal for 6, without anyone feeling the constraint. The meatballs were small, the size of a large marble, which meant the beef stretched furthest, and the broth was what carried the meal, becoming deeply savory from the long simmer with the meat. She mixed ground beef with breadcrumbs, egg, garlic, dried parsley, salt, and pepper, and rolled tiny meatballs, dropping them one by one into simmering beef broth with diced carrot, celery, and onion. The meatballs cooked through in the broth in about 10 minutes and flavored it as they cooked. She added small pasta, tortellini or orzo, toward the end and let it cook directly in the broth. The finished soup was golden and rich, and the small meatballs distributed evenly through every bowlful, so nobody got a bowl that was mostly broth. The pasta had absorbed the meaty broth and tasted of it entirely. The smell coming off the pot was deeply warming. A bowl of this soup was enough to make a difficult day feel slightly less so. That is not a small thing. Beef tacos with homemade shells. Before the taco kit made Friday night easy, there were the families who made their own shells by frying corn tortillas in hot oil until they crisped into the familiar folded shape. And the difference between a homemade shell and a store-bought one was the difference between something fragile and perfect and something that merely did the job. She heated oil in a deep skillet, folded a corn tortilla in half, and held it in the hot oil with tongs until one side crisped, then turned it to crisp the other, lifting it out to drain on paper towels. The shell was slightly irregular, thicker in some places than others, with small brown spots from the oil and a corn flavor that the packaged version had lost entirely. The seasoned ground beef went inside with fresh tomato, shredded iceberg lettuce, grated cheddar, and a spoon of sour cream. The shell shattered slightly with each bite rather than breaking cleanly, which was part of the appeal. The contrast between the crisp shell, the warm beef, the cold lettuce and sour cream was layered and immediate. Some things are worth doing the longer way. This was one of them. Beef and macaroni skillet. This recipe went by half a dozen names: American chop suey in New England, Johnny Marzetti in the Midwest, beefaroni when it came out of a can. But regardless of what anyone called it, the formula was the same. Ground beef, pasta, tomato, and cheese cooked together in one skillet until everything was unified and hot and ready to serve. She browned ground beef with onion and garlic, added canned tomatoes and tomato paste and a cup of water, brought it to a simmer, and added elbow macaroni directly to the pan. The pasta cooked in the tomato beef liquid, absorbing it as it softened, so by the time it was tender, the liquid had been absorbed and the whole thing was thick and glossy. She scattered shredded cheddar over the top and covered the pan for 2 minutes to let it melt. The cheese went soft and slightly stringy and pulled when she served it into bowls. The pasta was red all the way through. The beef was everywhere in it, crumbled fine and inseparable from the sauce. 1 pan, 25 minutes, a table full of people who were satisfied in the uncomplicated, honest way that this kind of food always managed to produce. Beef stroganoff. Beef stroganoff entered the American home kitchen in the 1950s as a dinner party dish with a vaguely European sophistication, and by the 1970s it had completely shed its occasion-only status and become a regular weeknight supper in homes across the country, particularly after home cooks discovered that ground beef worked nearly as well as the sliced beef sirloin the original required. She browned ground beef with onion, added sliced mushrooms, and cooked them until they had given up their moisture and begun to brown at the edges. Then stirred in a can of cream of mushroom soup, thinned with a little sour cream and beef broth. The sauce went creamy and pale and smelled of mushroom and beef and the gentle tang of the sour cream. Served over egg noodles, it was rich without being heavy, and savory without being sharp, and the sour cream gave the sauce a slight brightness that kept it from tasting flat. The mushrooms disappeared into it in a way that made their flavor present everywhere and identifiable nowhere. It was the kind of supper that made a Tuesday feel like it had been tended to with care. Pizza burgers. Pizza burgers occupied a particular place in the 1970s family kitchen that was entirely their own. They were not pizza and they were not burgers, but they combined the elements of both in a way that children found irresistible and parents found practical, which made them a frequent appearance on weeknight menus throughout the decade. She browned ground beef with onion and garlic, added pizza sauce from a jar and dried oregano, and let it simmer until thick. She split English muffins or hamburger buns, spooned the beef mixture onto each half, covered it with sliced or shredded mozzarella, and slid the whole thing under the broiler until the cheese bubbled and browned in spots. The mozzarella went soft and pulled in strings when you picked them up. The beef beneath it was savory and herby, and the pizza sauce was sweet tart, and the English muffin crisped slightly at the edges from the broiler heat. The smell coming out of the broiler was of melting cheese and oregano and browned meat. They were on the table in 20 minutes and gone from it in 10. That efficiency was its own kind of perfection. Tomato milk soup. A can of tomatoes runs $1.19. A cup of milk, about 30 cents. Butter, salt, a pinch of baking soda. Under $2, and it feeds you twice. You heat the tomatoes until they steam. You add a pinch of baking soda, and the pot hisses and foams. That is the acid neutralizing, so the milk will not curdle. You pour the milk in slow, and the whole thing turns the color of a sunset. It smells like tomato and warm cream at once. Midwestern farm women made this every autumn from 1900 through the 1960s. It appears in the 1954 Iowa Farm Bureau cookbook under the name Grandma's Tomato Bisque. Soft, warm, requires no chewing. For anyone with dental trouble, this is a full supper that never once asks anything of your teeth. Buttered noodles with poppy seed. A cup of egg noodles is 38 cents. Butter, salt, a spoonful of poppy seeds. 38 cents for the base and pennies for the rest. The noodles cook in 7 minutes. You drain them and drop them straight back into the hot pan with butter. They squeak against the pan as you toss them. The butter browns just slightly and turns nutty. The poppy seeds crackle. This is Hungarian, brought to Cleveland and Pittsburgh by immigrants in the 1890s. It appears in a 1962 Kentucky community cookbook that has never been digitized, listed simply as Sunday noodles. Soft, warm, forgiving. And 38 cents means you can make it on the last week of the month when the check has not come yet, and there is no shame in that. Skillet sausage and apple. One sausage link is about 90 cents. Half an apple, 40 cents. Butter, a pinch of sage. Under $2. You slice the sausage into coins and brown them hard in a dry pan. The fat renders and the edges char. You throw in apple slices and they hiss in the pork fat, going translucent at the edges, soaking up the salt and smoke. 4 minutes total. This is German, carried into Wisconsin and Missouri in the 1850s. Pork and apple were harvested in the same season and cooked together out of pure timing. Sausage is soft. Apple cooks tender. Nothing here fights back against a fork, and one pan means one thing to wash. Cream toast. 2 slices of bread, 30 cents. A cup of milk, 30 cents. Butter, flour, salt, pepper. Under $1. You melt butter, whisk in flour, and cook it until it smells like toasted nuts. You pour in milk and stir until it thickens and coats the spoon. You pour it hot over buttered toast, and the bread drinks it. The edges stay crisp. The center goes soft as pudding. New England widows ate this for 4 decades straight. It shows up in the 1896 Boston Cooking School cookbook, and it never left the region. 90 seconds of active cooking, that is it. And it is warm, filling, and gentle on a stomach that has stopped tolerating heavy food. Why did we stop making this? Who decided that $1's worth of milk and bread was not a real supper? Milk gravy on potato. 1 potato, 50 cents. A cup of milk, 30 cents. Butter, flour, black pepper. Under $1. The potato goes in the microwave for 6 minutes. While it cooks, you make the gravy. Butter, flour, milk, whisked until it thickens and coats the back of a spoon. Heavy black pepper. You split the potato and it steams. You pour the gravy in and it pools in the hollow. Appalachian, and it kept coal families alive through the 1920s and 30s, when meat was a Sunday thing and milk gravy was every other day. 6 minutes in a microwave and 3 minutes at a stove. No lifting a heavy pot. No draining boiling water, which is the single most dangerous thing an older cook does in a kitchen. Tuna and rice. A can of tuna, $1.20. A cup of rice, 30 cents. Butter, soy or vinegar, black pepper. Under $2. You warm the rice with a pat of butter until each grain glistens. You flake the tuna in and fold it through, off the heat, so it stays tender instead of going dry and stringy. A splash of vinegar cuts the oil. Japanese-American families made this in California through the 1950s and 60s. It was simple, it was fast, and it never made it into a single mainstream American cookbook. Canned tuna is soft, high protein, and shelf-stable. Rice keeps for a year. This is a supper you can make from a pantry with nothing fresh in the house at all. Boarding house peas and toast. A cup of frozen peas, 60 cents. Butter, flour, milk, 2 slices of bread. Under $1.50. You make a cream sauce, drop the peas in, and they turn bright green in 90 seconds. You spoon them over toast. The bread goes soft where the sauce sits and stays crisp at the crust. A woman in a Pennsylvania boarding house invented this in 1948, feeding 14 people on $11 a week. It spread through 3 states within a decade, carried by the boarders who left and never forgot it. Soft, warm, and the peas mean you get a vegetable in without any chopping, peeling, or standing. For anyone whose energy runs out by 5 in the afternoon, that matters more than any nutrition chart. Baked potato with butter. The simplest supper there is: a whole potato baked until fluffy and split open with butter, salt, and pepper. A potato cost a few cents in 1973. Butter and salt. Total then under 15 cents. Today, under $1. Fed 1. You bake a potato until the skin crisps and the inside goes fluffy. You split it open and load it with butter, salt, and pepper. The skin goes crisp. The inside goes fluffy and soft. The butter melts through. The baked potato came from universal home cooking. By 1973, it was a senior's easy supper nationwide. A baked potato with butter, supper with almost no effort. Mashed potatoes and gravy. The soft, comforting supper of mashed potatoes topped with a simple milk or drippings gravy. Potatoes cost a few cents in 1973. Milk, butter, and flour. Total then under 30 cents. Today, under $3. Fed 1. You boil potatoes until soft and mash them with butter and milk. You make a quick gravy and pour it over. The mash goes soft and creamy. The gravy pools on top. It needs no chewing at all. Mashed potatoes and gravy came from universal home cooking. By 1973, it was a senior's gentle supper nationwide. Soft mashed potatoes and gravy, gentle comfort for one. Potato and egg skillet. The supper that fried diced potatoes with a couple of eggs scrambled in, a full meal from the two cheapest things in the kitchen. Potatoes cost a few cents in 1972. Eggs, onion, and grease. Total then under 30 cents. Today, under $3. Fed 1. You fry diced potato with onion until golden. You crack eggs over the top and scramble them in. The potatoes go crisp. The eggs go soft. The onion sweetens everything. Potato and egg skillet came from universal thrift cooking. By 1972, it was a senior's supper nationwide. Potatoes and eggs in one pan, a full supper for pennies.